Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne-Pesatna. And we're here today with special guest, Paul Weiss. And he's here to share with us his new book, The Dharma of Direct Experience, Non-Dual Principles of Living. Paul began a serious practice in Zen as well as Tai Chi in 1966 and spent years in several trainings and monastic settings, including in schools and clinics in China. In 1981, he founded the Whole Health Center in Maine, where he teaches, counsels, and offers meditation retreats and his True Heart, True Mind Intensive. So let's welcome to the show, Paul Weiss.
Thank you, Marianne.
What an honor it is to have you here and to talk about your new book. What inspired you to write this?
Well, that's a good question. I actually talk about that at the beginning of the book. It was part of the process. I have, for many years have been teaching and running retreats and doing some writing based on, my collective experience and training over the years. And a lot of what I've had to teach, which has continued to evolve, also stemmed or was undergirded, you might say, by some very specific experiences, revelations or awakening experiences, but I never really referred to them much. I just kind of spoke from that place. And I was sitting one day, kind of relaxing, meditating, and appreciating, suddenly feeling a lot of gratitude for the experiences I had been given that were, I realized, the really foundation of my life. And in that moment I said, I shouldn't hold on to these. I should share them. And I realized that although I had some other books in mind, suddenly I said, this is the next thing I need to do. I need to start by letting people know where I'm coming from in terms of what I experienced and what that told me about the nature of reality and what that told me about, how to live my life, really,
Yeah.
So I set out in this book. Interestingly, one of the hardest things to do, and that I've always kind of steered away from, I thought, was just trying to write a book where you were systematically trying to say what you knew or what you wanted to say and try to include everything. Whereas to do something spontaneously seemed easier. So in my first book, I took 45 poems of mine that had spiritual content, and I concluded those poems, and I wrote a commentary on each poem, which made it easy because I was kind of like in dialogue with the poem. And in this case, I realized it was something similar because I took I think it was about 9 of my most significant experiences and did my best to communicate them, to describe them as clearly as possible, and then kind of commented based on those experiences. So my intention in recording the experiences was to be as kind of reliably, I almost videotape my at least because a lot of it's in my memory now, but my what the experience consisted of, including all of its quirky features, not try to airbrush it into the perfect whatever projection of a perfect spiritual or satori experience, but to actually talk about the details of what it felt like inside. Where was my mind present and not present? What was it that was leading up to the experience? And then where did it leave me? So I was really trying to almost be a filmmaker or a documentarian inside the experience and talk about it. And then I put it into the context of how does this fit into the context of, the traditional teachings, Buddhist teachings, Enlightenment teachings. And so that was the first section of the book. And that was actually my original intention. But then as I finished it, I said, well, I can't just leave it hanging. I need to talk a little bit about some basic principles here. What does this tell us? And what can we, learn from this that would be useful? And so I started working on the second section in which I just started with several ideas or principles or paradigms that to me seemed fundamental and significant. And then I kind of did a chapter on each one. And that's how the second part of the book began to evolve.
Well, thank you for taking the time to share that with us. And your title, the Dharma of Direct Experience. So when we look at that, what does that mean?
Okay, so first let me say direct experience. By what I mean by direct experience, there's a couple of ways or levels in which that can be understood. And one is, obviously when we're talking about what we're experiencing right now, rather than our ideas, or projections, and that we're in the moment talking about our direct experience. So that's one level of direct experience. But then there's a subtler level of that, because really, even when we're in the moment, seeming to be in our direct experience, the fact is that our experience is modified or travels through by way of all of our mental constructs, our mental representations, our sense impressions, this kind of thing. And so even our so-called direct experience is not truly direct, because it's coming through all the structures of the mind that tend to shape and form. And the most basic structures of the mind are dualistic structures, right? The structures that tend to basically separate us from everything else and divide the world up, in certain logical and separate ways. And that can be functional, but in the sense it's not truly direct. So the deeper meaning of direct experience, if we to talk about, let's say, an enlightenment experience, is when all the structures just fall away. And there's some other organ of knowing, you might say, that's simply directly apprehending reality. In my experience, one of the ways I talked about it in the book is, in that moment, it feels like reality is looking at itself, because that's all there is. And there's nobody in the way there called me that's separate. So that would be a direct or non-dual experience, because the structures of the mind can't experience that way. They can have an idea about it. But when those structures fall away, then there's nobody experiencing. There's just experiencing itself. So that's a kind of direct. That's pretty direct. And Dharma, of course, is an ancient Sanskrit term, both in Indian and in Hindu and Buddhist traditions. That means, has a lot of different meanings. But one level of the meaning is the law, the truth, the way of things, the nature of things, and also how to live in accord with, or let's say the Buddha Dharma would be the Buddha's teaching on the nature of reality, as well as the teaching on the practices that help us to become available to the nature of reality. So that would be one way of understanding the Dharma. So this is simply the Dharma, or that relationship to reality, that is based on understanding this capacity for direct experience and our availability to it. So, because a lot of Dharma, of course, is teaching, intellectual teaching, etc. But to recognize that an important part of the Dharma, and even more importantly, an important part of our own capacity as a human being, is to be able to directly experience.
So I know you talk about non-duality in your book, and I'd love for you to kind of break that down for our listeners that are new to that as well.
The simplest everyday, I like to say, you can have a very highfalutin intellectual or spiritual definition of non-duality, but one definition of non-duality is not to be at war with yourself, right? Not to be at war with the world. And whether or not there are certain moments in life when we're just present and things are what they are, and there's no self-consciousness, there's no separation, there's no putting things into categories. And in a sense, even though one may not think they're having, quote unquote, a spiritual experience, they're in a kind of natural, non-dual state of just being present for things as they are, because the structures, again, the dualistic structures of the mind, the structures of the mind that first separate everything and then kind of have an opinion about everything that's been separated, they're completely relaxed. And so we're just in harmony with things. So that is a kind of an everyday non-duality. And then the other level is simply to recognize, and I want to say one thing, actually. Non-duality is a tricky word, and I wasn't even sure I wanted that word in the title. It was not exactly my choice, because people have a fetish about the word non-dual and say, I'm non-dual. But in a sense, there's no such thing as non-duality, because non-duality is opposed to what? And as soon as you say opposed to what, you're already getting dualistic again. So it's just really relaxing everything and letting things be as they are. But at a certain level of that, there is the immediate perception that every way we separated ourselves out from the field of life, you might say, and every way we have separated ourselves out from being part of one interpenetrating wholeness, or as I say in the book, one of my first strong experiences, the word that came into my mind was inexhaustible non-exclusiveness. meaning you could never get to the end of how much ultimately everything was the same as everything else. There was it's natural for us, of course, to say everything is different than everything else. But at that level of perception, you see, that is just a distorted level of perception, that everything comes out of a field in which everything participates in everything else, everything gives rise to everything else, everything supports everything else, and there's nowhere you can make a line or a distinction. And it's even possible for our consciousness to simply recognize that and rest with that. And that's not meant to be lost in some, again, far out meditative state. It's a simplicity that also allows us to move into our life with a greater openness, a greater mutuality, a greater simplicity. So that's some of what I would mean by non-duality.
Well, thank you. In the beginning of our conversation, you talked about just the gift of your past experiences. And I think a lot of people are in a place where maybe they're new to that thought process, or perhaps this is something that they're working on. How do we get to this point where we can look at our experience as a gift and good and bad and labeling?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. How do we get to the point where we can look at anything as a gift, really? Yeah. And how do we begin to relax the labeling? And I think part of it starts by recognizing how much we don't do that, how much we have a pit that we carry consciously or unconsciously, instinctive ideas about things that in some way are negative, in which we shut down our capacity to experience the blessing of the moment. In fact, I have a long piece of writing, which may be part of my next book, called The Blessing Way. And it talks about how we've developed, again, as part of these structures of the mind, we naturally develop certain negative ideas about things. We're open to some extent, but beyond that, we're not, etc. And we don't realize how much these negative assumptions or these limiting assumptions structure and limit our way of experiencing, including a way of lessening, again, the gift of life, the openness and the mystery of things. So once we begin to recognize that, part of the process is to consciously recognize and, in a sense, take responsibility for where we notice ourselves bringing in a negative mindset and say, how do I begin to change that? How do I begin to reallow? How do I begin to bless my experience unconditionally? And that doesn't mean to become dumb about what's happening or what feels good or what feels bad, but it's how do we begin to learn to hold our experience in a way where we're not always imposing judgments on it, negative judgments. And how do we then begin to see that our own capacity to be present, our own capacity to be aware, and our own capacity just to hold things in compassion is our great, in a sense, our great gift, our great capacity to actually, to step into our full being, that we have that capacity as individuals. But we have to begin to recognize and then practice that, because by habit, we tend to fall away. So that means that circles right back around again to some basics of, let's say, meditation or Buddhist meditation, which starts with, in many cases, what's sometimes called choiceless awareness, just sitting and allowing it's easy to start with the breathing and other things that begin to focus my mind, but gradually just allow things, the practice of allowing things to be what they are, even allowing our own mental thoughts coming up to be what they are, but not clinging onto anything and not pushing away anything. That begins to open an open field in which the mind begins to develop a more spacious quality. And in that more spacious quality, we're not only more present, but more welcoming of reality. And that's what I call this capacity to bless, to be able to welcome reality and affirm things as they are.
And I appreciate you taking the time to go through this, because I think it's important to hear this from an expert like you. As again, I have enough to be dangerous, but that doesn't get us anywhere. So
there are nice meditations like Thich Nhat Hanh, who's just such a wonderful introduction, and also goes very deep, of course, to all of this. He has certain phrases that he uses in meditation and that I work with people too, like breathing in, I calm my body. Breathing out, I let everything go. Or aware of my body, I breathe in. Relaxing my body, I breathe out. Or breathing in, I rest in the present moment. Breathing out, I know it is a wonderful moment. And these are just beginning ways of getting ourselves to come into a relaxed relationship to this moment. And I think anybody, we're all, as human beings, we can all have moments where we feel very open, out in nature or for whatever reason. But to really cultivate that is the next step. Say, I want my life to really be about that, and I want to really learn how to be present and to allow that more and more. And that requires a conscious practice. Take on some kind of a practice where we're cultivating how our mind is working, So some of it is gifted to us, but some of it has to come from our deliberate practice. That's what practice is all about.
In your book, you talk about the paradox of suffering. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, it's obviously a paradox to say that, that reality is innately harmonious and beautiful and, radiant, or God is love, or any of this. And then to say the fact of the matter is that there's not only do we feel a lot of suffering, but when we look around us, there's incredible suffering in the world and throughout the history of humanity. How can both things be true at once? And how do we begin to make sense of that, and work with that? There's two levels at which we can approach that. And one is kind of to understand philosophically, well, how can that be? And I've talked about that at different times. But the other level, which is more immediate, is how do I be present with the fact of suffering in a way that begins to heal the suffering? And healing, the word healing, the word wholeness, these all come from the same root. How do I start with this thing of suffering, which seems to separate me, that seems to be painful? How do I begin to approach it in a way that is an opportunity for my healing? And in a sense, another way of saying that is, how do I begin to embrace it in a way that my relationship with suffering becomes non-dual? That as I bring love to, and one quick answer to that, so to speak, is if I bring love to suffering, then suffering has become an occasion for the awakening of my love. Normally, we bring, avoidance to suffering or bitterness or whatever it may be, but suffering gives us the opportunity for compassion. And compassion is a wonderful non-dual capacity. So in a way, the paradox of suffering in this world is that it becomes the occasion also for awakening an increasingly non-dual capacity and awakening our capacity for love. If we choose that way, if we're conscious enough to choose that. And so as a general principle and as a personal principle, that is how we approach the paradox of suffering. You can say, how can something so opposite from what I want, how can I hold space for it? And that's the paradox of non-separation. And of course, we've seen a lot of examples, perhaps among remarkable people or amazing people, where a person's suffering became the doorway to, a great realization on their part, or a great personal transformation. So it's like, I have a phrase that I mentioned in the book, and that I use a lot with myself, and I've shared with others. And it says, persist as love, despite all evidence to the contrary. And that's a kind of a non-dual formula. It's easy to say, all right, persist as love when it's easy. But what about all the reasons that make it obvious that it's not to do that? That's when you persist as love, despite the evidence to the contrary. And then that's where the healing and the next level of integration and, awakening can occur. Because we're discovering that love has nothing to do with how nice things are or favorable things are or how I'm feeling. Love has to do with my capacity to embrace things in wholeness. And therefore, in the beginning of our practice or early in our life, we imagine that love is just about, everything being more and more lovey, better and better. But ultimately, and we see this in all the spiritual traditions, love is about expanding our capacity to embrace in wholeness And then that ultimately also leads to what we part of what we experience inwardly as love.
So I think a lot of times people can confuse love as, or they get concerned that love means that they'll be a doormat, if they become more loving. Is that the case?
Our love sentiment, our love instinct, uh, we can exercise that at any time, and sometimes it may lead to putting ourselves in a position where we're a situation is taking advantage of us. But ultimately, our love is hand in hand with developing an inner strength, an inner capacity, or an inner integrity of being that is not about giving ourselves up, in a kind of codependent way to what was going on for someone else. It's about developing that inner strength and integrity that is part and parcel of and overflows with our capacity to be there for others and our capacity to love. And it's very important that we're cultivating that part of our own inner strength and capacity, or accomplishing that part of our own inner healing. Otherwise, our love is just, in a sense, another sentimental response or emotional response. But our deepest capacity to love is a powerful, strength that comes from cultivating a kind of strength. So, of course, that could be talked about at great length, but that's the distinction that I would make. One of the things I work with a lot is Tonglen, which you may be familiar with, and that's a Buddhist compassion practice, which is very old, in which you're deliberately breathing in the suffering of others into your heart and sending back from your heart the healing or blessing to them. And of course, that's a practice that if you're not developing a lot of inner integrity, it feels like, oh, I'm just taking everybody's pain on myself and now I'm left with it. But as we begin to develop our integrity through our own other meditation practices, our ability to feel our own groundedness, our own centeredness, our own fullness of being, etc., these become the foundations and being even to rest in our body, rest in our breath. By resting in these foundations, this foundation allows us to extend ourselves without losing ourselves, in the sense of being taken advantage of. Well, our foundation is broad, our base is broad, and so our loving can be broad. So I often give a lot of other meditation practices as a foundation for doing the Tonglen practices, because this begins to give us a sense of foundation and integration in life from which we can expand our capacity for loving.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to go through that. In your book, you talk about the words identification and intimacy. So, can you say a little bit more about that for us?
Yes. So normally, it relates to what we said at the very beginning about non-duality. Normally, we are identified with the full set of our outlook on the world, with our ideas, our opinions, our mental structures and representations, and we tend to see the world through that, which can work fine. It's our normal way of working, or sometimes it really gets us in trouble. But whenever we're doing anything, whenever we're identified with simply with some aspect of how we see the world, or our own, or our self-interest, or anything else, then we're lost in identification. I'm identified as a separate self. I'm identified with my separate needs. I'm identified with my projection on what's going on out there. And this is normal. This is our normal condition. This is how we go through life, because, as I say, we're not seeing directly. We're working through these representations. Intimacy is when all of that drops and I'm simply present for you, or simply present for this moment, or simply present for that bird call without saying, oh, but I'm just letting it in. In that moment of intimacy, there's nothing extra that's separating me, or no idea in the mind that I am somehow identified with that separated me from my experience. So at any given moment, you can say we can only, in a sense, be identified with our own mind. We can only be intimate with things as they are. And we can only be truly present for things as they are when we totally relax our own mind. And it's in the mode of intimacy that the other significance of that is uh, in any meditation practice that talks about the possibility for a like a quantum leap in experience, this mystery that we call an awakening experience. It is the ground. It's intimacy is the ground on which that's likely to happen. Right? If we are lost in our own thoughts and representations, there's no room for that to happen. But it's like an open field of availability that occurs when we're just resting in intimacy. And it's in that open field that sometimes this accident happens, this mysterious thing happens where the structures of the mind can no longer kind of hold themselves together and they just relax. And in that moment, a direct experience of reality, much larger than our minds could have imagined, much more one, much more unified than our minds could have imagined, simply becomes apparent to us. And it's not something we've done because there's no separate self there to do it. It's this complete relaxation, whereas I said in the beginning, it's like reality becomes intimate with itself. So, each of these things has this very cosmic, wow, reality becoming intimate with itself. But it all starts with the everyday things that we're capable of doing, simply relaxing, simply being open, simply being intimate with what is without the mind getting in the way, etc.
Where do you think people get hung up when it comes to this?
Well, we're all hung up because from the very beginning, from the very birth, of our of the ego in our minds, we're reinforcing the habit of experiencing ourselves separately, and developing a whole set of ideas subconsciously about the nature of reality. And this is something we need to do because, we need to. It's normal for us, our human functioning, aside from whatever we're talking about, the ultimate nature of reality. It's essential for our human functioning as human organisms to have some kind of sense of self that can navigate this world and take care of itself. So the structures of a separate self are natural. But then what happens is they get admixed with so many experiences, for many of us, trauma, or just the trauma of separation, the trauma of the fact that we're growing up in a world where, however good our parents are, things aren't beautiful all the time, or we don't always feel met, or there's all kinds of different kinds of suffering, disappointment, emotional, physical pain, etc. And so we develop a kind of an elaborate system of how do I take care of myself, what's okay, what's not okay, how do I need to protect myself. And a large part in that process, a large part of our simple, open availability and even our empathy with the world has to get managed. It's like as I mentioned in my book, one of the earliest things that opens up in us is our empathy field, which is a biological reality when we're when we are just present with the eyes of the mother at birth. That as I understand it neurobiologically, that attunement with the eyes of the mother begins the growth of a certain nerve network in the body. That is the nerve network that's responsible for allowing me to attune to others and recognizing other people. And it's that same nerve network that allows me to feel myself subjectively and have empathy for myself. So one of the first things that gets laid down in our life is this empathy field, which we're simply open to reality and open to others. But in a sense, we can't afford to stay there. We begin to discover, reality is not just being bathed in the eyes of the mother. There's a lot going on here. Some of it doesn't feel so good. So we begin to shut down some of that empathy field, and we begin to develop these mental circuitries that tells us how to be, how to survive, how to develop our self-image or our self-sense, etc. And so it's natural for us that we are living in the midst of this wiring, you might say, this network that keeps us separate, that keeps us in this other mode. But the great gift that we have as human beings, biologically, you might say, as well as spiritually, is that our brains and our nervous system have the capacity, and the most developed parts of our nervous system have the capacity to enter into a state of open presence. Right? We all have the capacity for non-judgmental presence, for openness, for attuning. We don't perhaps use it all the time, but we have the capacity for it. So as we build that capacity, we can begin to transform those automatic structures that keep us limited and separate, we can begin to deliberately cultivate a way of being that is becoming more open, right, and more intimate.
In your book, you talk about the twin principle. What is that?
Yes, I love that. You're asking me such great questions, like you're handing me ice cream cones here. Oh, well, I love to talk about the twin principle. The twin principle, which in a way we've been talking about right along, is the twin principle that the nature of being, right, is for itself. In other words, when we're simply one with being, or if we posit, a divine reality, or when we awaken to this universal harmony, when we have an experience of that, it doesn't have any secondary intention or need or dependency. It's there for itself. It's a self-affirming, open, integral reality, interpenetrating, interdependent reality. And that reality, by its nature, is kind of overflowing with creative energy. And we can say that this is like a metaphysical mystery. Why is this oneness, this unity of God? Why is it so creative and manifest as everything? So why does nothing or oneness manifest as everything? And in the most positive way of understanding it is its generosity of being, generosity of energy. So this principle is that this oneness of being, this integrity of being, also naturally expresses as a generosity of being, or a giving away of its own being. So in us too, as we cultivate, we're cultivating the capacity, and I should say then once the ego comes in, as we were talking about a moment before, a different principle comes in. The twin principle is the identity of the in itself. I exist in itself, and it also exists for others, for this generosity of being. But the ego comes in the middle of that and introduces a third principle, which is a fictitious principle, which is the for itself. Now I'm a separate thing that has to be here primarily for me. And in that very process, I keep myself separated from the whole. Whereas as I begin to relax that, and I simply begin to exist in itself, or in myself as I am, then I'm naturally available to others, and I live naturally as overflowing for others. And of so many principles, I give an example in my book of how this principle arises in different traditions. And in the Jewish tradition, for example, Hillel, who's a great Jewish sage who lived about a generation before Jesus, he has this very famous saying where he says, "If I am not for me, who will be? And if I am not for you, what am I? And if not now, when?" So to me, what that means is if I'm not present here for my own wholeness and own completeness, so I don't give my attention to that, no one's going to do it for me. But then if I'm not here for you in our mutuality of being, then what am I? What does it mean? I'm just another, separate thing on this earth. And if not now, when is it going to happen? If I can't be whole in myself and here for you right now, when is it going to happen? And so that's pointing to that same principle, the oneness of in itself, be whole in myself and for others. And with Jesus, to my mind, the two commandments, and I asked Jesus, what are the most important commandments? And he said there are two primary commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your being, all your strength, all your soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. No difference. And so often that phrase of Jesus is like it's not a churchy teaching. It's not saying shape up and love God and follow these principles. It's a call to wholeness. It's a call to being able to be present for this reality with all our being, all our heart, all our soul, all our strength. So in a sense, it's a call to integrity, to be in integrity with God, wholeness with God. And then the second principle is the same, like unto it. Having done that, be there for others and love your neighbors as yourself. So ever since I keep seeing that principle everywhere anyway. So that's the twin principle. So I talk about that in my book at some point.
For people who are new to meditation and the practice of this, I mean, you speak like a philosopher, and I love hearing you talk about the Zen practices and meditation in Buddhism.
Hmm.
Where do you think you have developed all this wisdom from?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I've been on this trail for a long time, but whatever it was that drew me in this direction, I think I would say that first of all, there has to be an inspiration that leads us to search and that leads us to practice. You know, the Buddha says the first step is understanding, and the second step is intention. So once you understand, oh, there's something more here than just my ego, that leads to the intention of, well, how do I be available for what that is, and then how do I practice? But before all that was clear to me, at a very young age, I was just drawn to these things, and I began practicing Zen at a very young age. And that consisted of, for years and years, just watching my breath or counting my breath. But some part of me knew there was a good reason to be doing that, so that was just my conviction. And then as I began to deepen into meditation, you know, there was just a more integrated sense of being present. And then it just continued from there. And there's, you know, and even our emotional work is a part of that. I also did a lot of deep emotional work on myself, and then began to practice doing that too, because so much of our energies and our separateness are tied up in our emotional history and things. So that's also, all these dimensions help us to unfold and to do our work. But I would say that to keep it very simple in terms of meditation is to, the moment we say, you know, I also have to take some time just to sit down, just to be here, just to pay attention, just to let myself breathe, just to be in my body, and see what's here, let everything be. And that doesn't happen very romantically in the beginning. We just sit there, you know, our mind is running on, or our knees are aching. But some part of us says, no, this is important. I have to. And gradually, because of that, a seed is planted in which we can begin, in addition to everything else going on in our life, that part of our life can be nurtured and room can be made for it.
Well, I think I'll put you on the hot seat here with
Okay.
this question. And so when we look at just life in general, what is the meaning of life?
I find myself, you know, without intending, to be in this kind of Zen position of just a big smile on my face. But if I was to translate that smile, what it would say is, any attempts to come up with an idea or a thought or a meaning, right, is already separating. It's just coming up with an idea. Whereas to relax and open with a smile, you know, you might say, and to feel love in your heart is already expressing the meaning without philosophy, without words, because you might say it's to allow life to come into itself in its fullness. It's not about something I have to do somewhere or make happen or a philosophical idea. It's the place where life is allowed to come into itself, where love is allowed to come into itself. You know, one Tibetan teacher says very clearly the meaning of life is compassion. You know, if that's the unique thing we get to do here, simply because there's suffering, we get to bring compassion, and that is the vital spiritual realm. So we can also talk that way. Obviously, because books and books have been written, we can go on and on talking about the meaning of life. But you know, in the series of meditations that I often give, and these come from Thich Nhat Hanh, who is just wonderful. Where I started out saying, you know, breathing in, I calm my body. Breathing out, I let everything go. The last one in that series that I work with is breathing in, I calm my body, and breathing out, I smile. And the smile is a way of coming into this moment of being and giving our simple affirmation. And the smile is a very beautiful thing because, you know, biologically, that smile is directly connected to the heart. When we relax with a complete smile, there's a softening, you know, in the face, a softening in the chest, a softening in the heart, a softening in our life. And for that moment, we're simply available for life naturally and for others in a very gentle and open and loving way. And then to have to construct some kind of philosophical meaning beyond that would be really extra.
You get extra
Yeah.
credit for that, right?
Extra unnecessary work, because no understanding of the meaning of life is going to make us happy. But to relax and smile in this moment, is going to make us available. So, and in that moment, you could say, well, reality is there for itself. What more meaning could there be?
Well, I feel like in many ways, the last few years, what we've all been through has made us kind of look at life in a new way and reassess what's important. And
Yes,
being in the present moment, yeah, from your book, that's one thing I'm just able to just pick up right away is just being in that present moment. What a gift that is.
Yes, yeah. Because it's all here. I mean, as I think I say in the phrase I use in the opening chapters, all reality begins in this moment of experience. Where else could it begin, right? So this moment of experience, and this moment of awareness or presence is the doorway to everything, right? But we so rarely do we come back to sit in this doorway, right? But once our mind goes into trying to figure out everything that's out there, we're no longer sitting in the doorway, et cetera, So to be able to recognize the gift of, and the time to give it priority, to relax and be with this moment. And there's so many ways of being with the moment, to open ourselves up to sounds all around us, to open ourselves up to our own breathing, right? And even to open ourselves up to, the movements of feeling and in the body, of emotion and or thoughts, and to be able to see and feel our passing emotions, but simply be present for them, not to turn them into some kind of opinion about myself or my opinion about others, or some way of acting or some way of reacting, but simply noticing the sensations of feelings, the miracle that we have feelings, and simply be present with them and breathe with them is also a way of resting in the present moment, and is very healing to do.
Is there a practice you can walk us through right now for our listeners?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. I'll give, and I can just say, the simplest practice would be to start with just one simple thing, like watching the breath come and go. But I'll just put a couple of things together. So first of all, I sometimes work with what I would call mantras, which are just little phrases that keep us on track. And one mantra I sometimes work with is body, breath, and feelings, or body, breath, and being. And we're being invited by this mantra to just be present for it one step at a time. So wherever we are in this moment, or presumably we're sitting somewhere, and sit comfortably, and then just bring up the word body as a way of reminding ourselves to just tune in and be present with the body, simply. And the mind's always going to want to wander away. That's natural. But we're using this practice and the word body to keep bringing us back. And then we can begin to notice, just saying body may not ground us very much, but then we can begin to be very specific. Let me actually feel the felt sensation of my backside sitting on my chair or on my cushion. And let me notice, so I'm not thinking about my body, I'm not visualizing my body, I'm actually feeling into it. What does it feel like to be a body? And I'm being very specific. Let me feel my backside on the chair. And then second, let me rest there. Can it be sufficient for me in this moment to feel that sensation that I call backside on my chair, but it's just a sensation that I notice, and simply rest there and use that as a way of staying present for this moment. And at the same time, I'm starting to feel grounded. I might even feel that sense of groundedness, or feeling the sensation of my feet on the floor. Actual sensation that tells me, perhaps even if my eyes are closed, oh, my feet are resting on the floor, and to feel that sensation. And as we feel these simple sensations, feel my backside, I feel my feet, we notice that I can feel more than one thing at once. If I'm just in my awareness, it's very open. So I can feel my backside, and then I can feel my arms, my hands resting together on my lap or touching. I can feel my feet on the floor. I can feel my back resting against the back of the chair. And I can go through these slowly, adding each new thing without letting go of the other one, and noticing, wow, I can really stay present for all of that at once. And in that way, I'm beginning to practice a body awareness that simply keeps me present and one with myself in a way. I may even have a kind of general sense, we all have an inner sense of our whole body sensation. I know what shape my body is in, I know what posture I'm sitting in. And that's an inner sensation. So I can feel my overall body, I can feel my feet on the floor. And so in the beginning, we can just practice, can I allow all those sensations in? And thus I'm getting a whole sense of my body. My mind is busy, that's hard, but as I practice, I can feel that. And that's already quieting my mind, tuning me into myself. And then I'll add to that, I'm sitting here with my bodiness, and part of that is let me notice my breathingness. And I just watch the rhythm of my breath coming and going, however it's happening. Let it come, I let it go. And I also realize that breathingness is not separate from my bodiness. So I'm just starting to relax here as a breathing bodiness. The rhythm of my breath, groundedness of my body are all part of a sensation of being present, of being here for myself, of being grounded. And one of the beautiful things about the breath is that it models for us just letting things in, letting things out, the rhythm of life, the reciprocity. Just porous to this moment. And so stage one is just being there for the body, being there for the breath. And this is a practice we can do for, months and years and deepen into. And then, only when I'm feeling settled enough, my mind is calm enough and non-reactive enough, that comes from just feeling my body, just feeling my breath. Then I also allow myself to notice perhaps, are there any emotional feelings in my body, or any subjective feelings, and not turn them into something, but be present for them the same way that I'm here for my body, same way that I'm here for my breathing. They're just sensations of my life. And so I'm present for them. My whole awareness is here. My relaxation is here. And I'm learning to integrate, be present with, and be whole with this moment of bodiness, this moment of breathingness, this moment of feelingness. And as I relax with that, not to hurry that through, we may have a certain emotion that's troubling us. But now we're just resting with it, breathing with it. I can feel its sensation and I can breathe with it, which begins to integrate it. I can begin to feel more one and more present and more whole, even though I'm feeling that feeling. And over time, that may begin to also lead into just more of a sense of a feeling of presence, that there's something about me that's just present. That's not one thing or another, good or bad or this or that, but there's a sense of my underlying presence in which my feelings are included, my body is included, my breathing is included. And that would be a nice, simple, integral practice that we could work with for a long time to deepen in our meditation.
Thank you so much, Paul. I really appreciate you going through that with us, and what a just profound practice that was. As I was doing, I could feel stress leave.
Of course, right. Because, I know our time is probably limited, but our stress is the result of our body's processing of accumulated, stress, in a sense, threat to the well-being of the body, which comes just from stressful activity. And it affects a certain part of our nervous system, of automatic nervous system, and it tends to leave us with stressful thoughts or feelings, which keeps the stressful biology going, and it goes in a circle. And whenever we intervene with that and step out of that cycle, which always means simply being present, I can even feel a feeling I call stress, then I can just be present for it and breathe with it in the same way. I've broken the cycle, and now I'm coming into a presence cycle rather than a stress cycle. Very powerful.
That is, my goodness. Well, Paul, where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community and learn more about your work? And I know you've got an intensive coming up as well.
Yes. We have an intensive coming up the second week of June, the 8th to the 12th, which is a kind of a process we've been doing now for 40 years, in which you might say all of the teachings, that we've been talking about, come together in this. It's a very intensive, gentle but intensive process, that combines a basic contemplation, which simply means being able to be present for ourselves as we are, with communication, and developing a intimate communication with others connected to an intimate relationship to our own selves. And so that people, over the course of 3 days, working with the question, who am I? Not as an intellectual question, but as a way of tuning in to what's my realist experience of myself right now? Can I stay present for it? And then whatever comes up, I communicate it to my partner, who's just a pure listener. Right? And that goes on for a while, and then we change roles, and I just be a pure listener for my partner. What happens over 3 days is I'm going into deeper levels of myself, becoming more integrated, at the same time that I'm learning to become more present and open with a partner. Intimate, not in the sense of, personal intimacy, but intimate in the sense of just being totally present. And those two things together seem to contribute from both sides to that capacity to have an awakening experience or a shift in consciousness, which is what can also happen on those. So that's called True Heart, True Mind, that process. It's also done elsewhere under other names, but I've been doing it that way for many years. And it's on our website, and there's a lot of information about, you can go to True Heart, True Mind and find out all about that process, which is kind of our flagship retreat, you might say. And on our website also, you'll see everything we've been doing over the last 40 years, what our principles are, where we're coming from. You can access a lot of tapes of talks of mine, including a whole series of talks on Tonglen that I referred to before. And you can reach me directly. I also do, counseling personally and remotely. So I'm just available. And so that our website is thewholehealthcenter.org. You have to have the in there. thewholehealthcenter.org.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Well, the opposite, absolutely even more so. Thank you so much for being willing to have me on. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Paul. It has been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, The Dharma of Direct Experience, Non-Dual Principles of Living. The Dharma of Direct Experience is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and everywhere books are sold. And remember, support our indie bookstores, so if you don't see it on the shelf, just ask for them to order it. Well, on that note, we're going to pause here for a quick moment, and we'll be right back after this message. I'd like to thank Jason Eastwood at Guitarfulness for sharing his inspiring music and talent with us. His music is known worldwide for cultivating atmospheres of harmony, inner peace, and clarity. Visit Jason's website at guitarfulness.com. Join his newsletter, be part of his community, and download his music. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary. A recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.